Further amendments to this title?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Deal.
I have an amendment at the desk, 2A.
Clerk will report the amendment and have it distributed.
Amendment to the committee print offered by Mr. Deal. Add at the end of Title V
Chairman,
the following.
Reserve a point of order.
Gentlelady from Colorado reserves a point of order. Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Deal, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As many of you recall, I raised the issue of pricing transparency in health care during proceedings we had this past fall. I think that the issue of knowing what you're paying and what it's going to cost you should pertain in health care as it does in most everything else. If you're going to buy something, a good or a service, you generally know in advance how much it's going to cost. That is not true when it comes to health care. Some of you will recall the illustration I used of a young man who works here on the Hill who last year had to have an emergency appendectomy. There was confusion as to whether or not he had insurance coverage, and several weeks after he got home, he received a bill in the mail for $19,000 for a one-night stay. Finally, when it was clarified that he did have insurance, it was settled by the insurance company paying $2,100. With that kind of differential, is it any wonder that the #1 cause of personal bankruptcy in this country is the fact of medical bills that people simply cannot pay? What this amendment does is simply require hospitals that are receiving payments from Medicaid to publicly disclose the prices charged for the services to the uninsured and to self-paying patients. I think patients ought to have a right to know what they're going to be charged in advance and not be surprised by it after the fact. I would urge the adoption of this amendment, and I would yield back the balance of my time unless someone else wishes to claim it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Mr. Pallone.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to respond in opposition. Mr. Deal has raised the issue of transparency, and particularly with hospital charge sheets and in other situations, and I'm sympathetic to that. But I just don't think that this is the time to do it. I mean, we really don't know whether this information is useful. It may just make it more difficult, I think, to move ahead with the legislation. I have said to him that, we certainly intend to have hearings in the subcommittee to address these transparency issues, and it's certainly something that could be done in the context of health care reform and the hearings that we would have on health care reform. But I think that right now it only serves to increase, possibly the burden on hospitals, and it needs to have a hearing and have more of an opportunity to see in what context we should do this. I don't think the information is necessarily going to be helpful to individuals right now without further investigation of the whole issue of transparency in this context. So I would urge opposition to the amendment, not because we disagree that these types of things need to be done, but I just don't think that this is the time to do it without further hearings and further investigation of it.
Would the gentleman yield?
Certainly.
Could you give me some indication as to when we might expect those hearings?
Well, we're going to have a series of hearings on the whole health care reform issue, and we can certainly raise this in the context, but I know we've been busy with the stimulus right now, so I don't have a time period, but I think it can be taken up in the context of health care reform.
Gentlemen, yield to me, Mr.
Certainly.
Pallone. Well, I think you're absolutely right. When we do health care reform, we should look at what kinds of information will best enable consumers to make informed choices about their care. But I don't think the legislation we're debating today is the right place for this kind of an endeavor. But I would join you in pledging to Mr. Deal that we're going to review it and we'll have a further opportunity to review the matter.
Will the chairman yield for a question?
It's Mr. Pallone's time.
Will the subcommittee chairman yield for a question?
I think my time's actually run out, Mr. Chairman.
I was just simply going to inquire from the minority standpoint if we could have some sort of timeline as to when to expect these hearings on health care reform, because many of the things you've discussed today will fit into that venue, and I think it's fair to keep us apprised as to what the plans
We certainly will.
are.
We certainly will keep everybody apprised of the schedule and the plans, and and want to discuss all these issues. All time has expired on this amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
Gentlelady from Colorado withdraws her reservation. On a point of order, all those in favor of the Deal amendment will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. The noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to.
Ask for a recorded vote.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingell. No. Mr. Dingell votes no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck votes aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania, aye. Mr. Burgess. Okay. Ms. Blackburn. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye.
Have all members responded to the roll? If no other member wishes to be recorded, the clerk will tally the vote.
He votes no, Mr. Mel? Okay. On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 11 and the nays were 32.
11 ayes, 32 noes. The amendment is not agreed to.